And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Good morning, and welcome to The Law Show here on CIL 650. Good to have you with us. We have a couple of guests from Murphy-Battista back with us in studio on this episode of The Law Show, in which we're going to talk about treatment, rehabilitation, and ICBC Part 7 benefits. Always a pleasure to welcome Joe Murphy from Murphy-Battista back to the program. Hello, Joe.
Good morning, Sterling.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I am great, thanks. Please introduce us to the newest member of the firm from a show perspective. I haven't met Derek before.
Sterling, with me this morning is DerekMah, one of the senior lawyers in the firm. Derek's got an interesting background because he started as a physiotherapist. He did his physio training, worked as a physio for 5 years. Then he went back to school, into law school, graduated from law school, articled with a large Vancouver defense firm, was with them for about 4 years when he and I met, and he joined the firm, which I believe was about 6 years ago. That would be my guess.
A little longer.
6, 8?
I think it's 8.
Okay, there we go. There we go. So he's gone through the career of being a physiotherapist and the career of being a defense lawyer, and now he's one of our senior lawyers.
Interesting stuff. Well, welcome to the program, Derek. It's about time we met then, don't you think?
Thank you for having me on.
Well, tell us the story, because you had this wonderful career going. You were a physiotherapist. That's a very credible and solid career. You were at it for 5 years, and suddenly you hit the brakes and decided to become a lawyer. Now, what inspired that decision?
Well, it's a good question because I don't really know. It was one of these things that just unfolded the way it happened. I was in the gym with a friend of mine who's a physio, and we both decided, maybe we'll go write the LSAT and see what happens, and so we did, which was probably a good thing that we had a job at the time.
Is that a law school entrance exam?
It is.
Okay.
But it took all the pressure off from writing the LSAT because there's a bunch of kids all there, and this is all they wanted to do, and they hinged on everything.
And you already had a real job.
I had a real job.
Right.
So there was no pressure on that, and I wrote the LSAT, got my mark back, decided I'd apply. I got into law school, and that was when I had to make up my mind about what I wanted to do. And so I chose to go to law.
Interesting stuff. Now, Joe was saying that you worked for a defense firm, a fairly well-known defense firm. So in those years, this would be right out of law school. You went to work for a large law corporation.
That's correct.
And I would think, in some ways, learn the playbook of big companies who defend big companies.
Well, I think that's important, that we know. I got the experience there of knowing how defense lawyers think.
Right.
How insurance companies think, what they're looking for. And that really helps me on this side of it when we're dealing with insurance companies and adjusters all the time.
Right. Now, Joe, back us up to 1982, the founding days when you and Mr. Battista, the two Joes, put together this personal injury law firm. I'm going to come back to Derek and find out why he ended up in this particular branch of the law. But take us back to the early days. You two and one or two assistants back in the early days.
Sterling, we began with 2 lawyers, Joe Battista and I, and 2 secretaries.
Two of them, okay.
We rented 2 offices and 2 little secretarial bays. Naming of the firm was easy, of course. There was just Joe and I. So it was Murphy-Battista. Interest rates, I remember vividly, were 19%, January of 1982. So it was almost unheard of that a new business would open, but we did, and we began then. Today we're 15 lawyers. We have about 55 support staff, and we've just opened a Kelowna office. So we have our main office is in Vancouver, but we have an office in the Okanagan as well.
Okay.
So it's grown and grown, although the philosophy was never to grow. The philosophy was just to stay small and just work on the quality of the representation for our clients.
And did you and Joe Battista, right from step one, was it always going to be about personal injury law?
Primarily, we started out, and that was probably 75-80% of our practice. And now our practice is 100% dealing with injury and insurance work. So injury cases, mostly car accidents, but there's a whole bunch of different ways people get hurt. We also act in insurance claims, disability insurance claims. We have fire insurance claims. You get a house or a business that burns down and the insurance company won't pay. So there's all sorts of ways. Life insurance, although those cases are fairly rare. So it's either an injury where you have an insurance company on the other side, or it's a straight insurance claim, and that's essentially all we do.
Okay. Derek, why did you, after working for a major defense firm, why did you choose to go to a smaller firm and basically cross the street? Because now, the old job, you were representing the companies, the insurance companies, the big players. In this new assignment, you're representing individual injured people. Why did you make the change, and what drew you to it?
Well, certainly what's interesting is I literally did cross the street to get to Murphy-Battista. It's an interesting story. At the time, I knew I wanted to do plaintiff's personal injury work because that's where my heart, I really label. I want to help the person as opposed to the corporations.
Okay.
And I always thought Murphy-Battista had the best reputation from doing defense work. So I had met with Joe, and at that time he was going through renovations at the firm, and it was going to take some time to call me back, and he said, I'd love to have you on board, but we're doing renovations. I literally have no office space for you right now.
Okay.
So I said, okay, that's fine. And then he said, I'll be in touch with you. And it was about probably a year later that Joe called me, and at that time everything had been ready, and he said, let's meet again, and that's when I moved on over there.
Interesting stuff. Not exactly the swiftest renovator is hired for that particular job.
No. That was delegated to someone else. That's beyond our control. But as Derek said, he literally crossed Granville Street.
Right.
From a tower west of Granville at Georgia to the tower east where we are.
At 650.
And Scotia Tower, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, on the program today, as I identified at the beginning of our conversation, we're going to talk about treatment, rehabilitation, and something called ICBC Part 7 benefits. While we understand treatment and rehabilitation, or at least we think we do, I, on the other hand, have no clue, Joe, what ICBC Part 7 benefits are. Please help me out.
Sterling, the interesting thing about ICBC is it's probably one of the major expenses everyone has each year.
Sure.
Is the $1,500 or $2,000 you pay for insurance. And unlike other insurance companies or policies, you don't get a copy of the policy. You get a little sheet or two from the agent. They fold it up and put it in that little plastic
folder. And
folder.
Put it in your glove compartment and forget about it.
You don't get it. The reality is the actual policy is like a pocketbook. It's quite extensive. And included in the basic coverage is something called no-fault insurance. It's called no-fault because if you're hurt or killed, it doesn't matter whose fault the accident is, you get these benefits. So they're called Part 7 benefits or no-fault benefits. And they're paid regardless of whose fault the accident is. So if I'm a pedestrian and I step out into the path of a bus and get run over and hurt, I'm entitled to these benefits.
Okay.
It provides for money for medical expenses. It provides money for treatment, medication, equipment. It also provides wage loss benefits of up to $300 a week. But of course, like every insurance policy or coverage, there's limits, there's restrictions, and then added is the rules that ICBC internally makes up, saying, well, we will pay for this and we won't pay for that. But the good news is there's funding available. It's up to $150,000. That's the maximum amount available to pay for treatment and rehabilitation. If you have someone who's very badly hurt, and I'm thinking of a quadriplegic, they do house renovations, they will buy a wheelchair accessible van.
Of course, yeah.
But the reality is that $150,000 is exhausted very quickly.
You bet.
A wheelchair accessible van with a lift is $60,000.
I believe that, yeah.
Home renovations, a modest renovation in terms of being able to build ramps and getting in or out, that could easily be $40,000 minimum. You buy wheelchairs, power wheelchairs, $12,000. So it's great that the funds are available, but if you're a spinal cord injured person, the benefits don't last long. And the $150,000 figure has been the amount of the coverage since the early 1990s. So what's that, 25 years?
Yeah.
And there's been a big push saying, well, why don't you increase it? Look at what inflation's done. But for some reason, ICBC's balking at taking that number of 150 and making it 200 or 250.
So you really have to fight to get more, since that's the threshold they seem to want to stick to.
Well, if you reach the 150, they say we're not going to pay anymore. Although there are things. ICBC's policy is to pay out of the Part 7 funds for any MSP expenses. So if I'm injured and I go and see my doctor and the doctor charges medical services plan $200, they pay the $200 out of the Part 7 fund, even though the policy says they can't do that. So there's been this political decision made saying we want to take money out of ICBC and we want to pay it to the MSP program. But the policy itself says, no, that can't be done. That shouldn't be done.
I want to go back to,
So-
to something you talked about earlier, though, and that's the whole business of no fault. Because I think no fault is a phrase that every driver in British Columbia understands. Well, in our province, we have no fault insurance. Anybody with a BC driver's license will tell you that. Ask them what that means, and I don't think 1 in 20, Derek, would have a clue.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, well, maybe a month ago I was actually rear-ended, and we were exchanging information, and a witness came up and she said, "This doesn't matter about anything because we're all no fault here anyways." Which, I didn't say I'm a lawyer and this is what it really means, but we don't understand it. The public doesn't understand what that means. When we talk about no fault here, we're talking about their accident benefits or Part 7 benefits. This is what they get for the medical care.
And drivers seem to think that no fault it works the other way around. It's all about who caused the accident, who was responsible or not, and it doesn't matter anyway because everybody's going to get paid. Yeah. And that's all we know.
We have no fault for these benefits that Joe was talking about, but when it comes to your civil claim or your tort claim, that's when you sue the driver that hurt you. That's not a no-fault system.
Right, because if you identify a person as a victim of a crime in which someone was, for whatever negligence perhaps, malice, who knows, but nonetheless there was an injury caused by someone. That's fault, and that person is going to get nailed in court, right?
That's correct. That's correct. So in that scenario where someone rear-ends somebody, if that rear-ending vehicle, the driver who's at fault for the accident, was hurt, he could actually get his own accident benefits because it's no fault. He could go to ICBC and say, "I need physiotherapy." And he goes to the physiotherapist and he gets some treatment there that ICBC will pay a portion of. But he does not have a tort claim against the other driver. The other driver that got hit has a tort claim against him.
So, I guess lesson number 1 from today's program, and I hope there will be several, but lesson number 1 would be that really, in British Columbia, no fault applies only to benefits paid out. It has nothing to do with causation when it comes to accidents. Is that reasonable, Derek?
I think it's a good way of summarizing it.
Yep.
Because most drivers think exactly the opposite, Joe.
Often there's confusion, and it's, as I say, you don't get a copy of the policy. And if someone's never had to deal with ICBC, if they're fortunate and they've never been involved in an accident where they're hurt, they just don't understand how the system works.
Sure.
So there's a real lack of knowledge, and that's good for people because it means nothing bad's ever happened to them.
Okay. So in the instance, though, where you are, let's go back to your rear ender. On a sunny day in Vancouver, boom, somebody hits you, and an innocent bystander comes up and offers to volunteer her name and so on, but also completely misunderstands the scenario that she's just witnessed. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, it was very, very ironic. And I said to my wife, she was in the car with me, and I just said, it's interesting she said all that because she does not understand how the system works.
And yet
here.
she was quite willing to help and give you her name and say, listen, I saw it all happen, and, I'll be glad to testify on your behalf, or that kind of thing. So she was cooperative and positive, just dead wrong when it came to the reality of the facts.
Yeah, that's true. She was absolutely wrong with that. And I think that's the common misunderstanding here. In the public is that they think some people think there is no fault. I mean, you get in a car accident, it doesn't matter who's at fault for this, nothing's going to happen, it's all going to be the same. But that's not the case. It's not the case at all.
If you are found to be at fault, does, like other jurisdictions, Joe, where private insurers just nail you, if you're found to be at fault for an accident, your premiums go up. If you're found at fault for a second accident, your premiums go up a second time. If it happens to you a third, they will cancel your insurance. They don't want any part of you. What happens in British Columbia when you're found to be at fault? Do our premiums go up?
ICBC Sterling has a formula they use, and depending on how long you've driven for without an accident claim, you get 1 or 2 or 3 claims without your premiums going up.
Okay.
So ICBC operates on the basis that if we're your long-term insurer and you have an accident, that's okay, as long as you don't have too many.
Mm-hmm.
And ICBC has the ability to crank up a premium, but it doesn't have the right to say to someone, we will not insure you.
Aha.
The basic insurance, the basic policy they have to sell to anyone that comes and has a vehicle and has a valid driver's license but the rates can go up and up and up depending on the claims history.
So that's the difference in a province in which government insurance forms the basis of automobile insurance. They can't decline anybody.
Correct. But if I could just say this, Sterling, and people are usually surprised when I say this. I've been a lawyer for 40 years. Prior to that, I worked as an insurance adjuster when I went through law school. The best thing that ever happened to the motoring public in BC is the government brought in ICBC. It's a well-run, well-organized Crown corporation that provides an excellent insurance product for a reasonable amount, and it's transparent. So the private companies that have been so successful at lobbying governments to change laws on the basis that the sky is falling,
Right.
Aren't transparent. And the reality is when they've said the sky's falling, what they haven't usually said is, well, the problem is we've had a poor return on our investments, but we don't want to admit that. So let's just say that these injured people are all faking their injuries and they're getting all the windfall money, and we've got to do something about that. The jurisdictions where they've changed the law, and Ontario is a good example. The government was lobbied by the private insurers to change the law. They said if you don't change the law, the sky's going to fall. The law has been changed repeatedly, and the premiums in Ontario have gone up and up and up.
You bet.
Whereas in BC, again, with the transparency, our premiums have been quite stable. There's been some increases, but those increases are nothing compared to these other provinces where the law has been changed.
Interesting.
At the behest of the insurance industry.
It is interesting, and this is not the first time. Derek is joining us for the first time on the program, but this is not the first time one of your colleagues from Murphy-Battista, Derek, has praised ICBC, while at the same time, of course, spending a great deal of time talking about details of cases that they have fought ICBC over. Nonetheless, the premise here is that in British Columbia, despite anomalies and rare cases where things do go off the rails, we are, in the perspective of Murphy-Battista, we are well served overall by ICBC, and in fact, we're darn lucky to have them.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
I think we have a very good system here in BC compared to the other provinces. It's a very, very good system. In Alberta, there's a cap on, they called it a soft cap on pain and suffering damages. You had to reach a certain threshold before you could actually get money for your pain and suffering. And that was brought in, I think, about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But we do have a good system here. It could be better, but it's a good system compared to the other provinces.
Okay, that all said and identified quite clearly, there are times when individuals are not particularly well served by the insurance companies, whether it's ICBC or a disability company or whatever. And our guests, with Murphy-Battista, Joe Murphy, and DerekMah, are going to talk about those occasions when something just doesn't quite go right. We'll talk about treatment and rehabilitation and more when we return.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.